The village of Nakhon Rai was nestled high in the mountains, a place where time seemed to stand still. Shrouded in perpetual mist, the village was both beautiful and eerie, with dense forests that hemmed it in from all sides. The villagers lived simple, quiet lives, their days marked by the rhythm of nature, but there was an undercurrent of fear that clung to them, an unspoken dread that lingered in the air. Arin had not set foot in the village for nearly a decade. The last time she had visited, she was just a child, clinging to her grandmother's hand as they walked through the narrow, winding streets. Now, she was returning as a grown woman, her life in the city far removed from the world she had left behind. The passing of her grandmother had been sudden, and the news had reached Arin too late to say her goodbyes. As she stepped off the old, rattling bus at the village entrance, Arin was struck by how little had changed. The same crooked houses lined the cobbled streets, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. The same ancient trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Even the air felt the same, heavy, damp, and thick with the scent of earth and pine. The villagers stared as she walked past, their eyes following her every move. Arin felt their gazes, curious and wary, but she offered polite nods and continued on her way. She knew what they were thinking, a city girl, too modern for this place, out of touch with the old ways. But Arin had come with a purpose. Her grandmother had left her the old family manor, a crumbling estate that had been in the family for generations. It was her duty to take care of it now. The manor stood at the edge of the village, separated from the rest of the houses by a thick line of trees. As Arin approached, she felt a chill run down her spine. The house loomed before her, its once grand facade now faded and worn. Ivy crawled up the walls, and the windows were clouded with dust. The front gate creaked as she pushed it open, and the path leading to the door was overgrown with weeds. She paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath before turning the old brass key in the lock. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a dim, musty interior. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and disuse. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through the grimy windows. Arin set her suitcase down in the entryway and took a moment to survey her surroundings. The manor was just as she remembered, grand yet decayed, filled with relics of a past long gone. The wooden floors creaked underfoot as she moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As she explored the manor, memories of her childhood visits flooded back. She remembered running through these halls, laughing as her grandmother chased her, the sound of her grandmother's voice calling her name, the warmth of the kitchen where they would sit together and sip tea. But those memories felt distant now, like echoes from another lifetime. Just as she was about to head upstairs to find her old room, a knock on the door startled her. Arin opened it to find a group of villagers standing outside, their faces lined with worry. The village elder, a wiry man with gray hair and a deep frown, stepped forward. "Miss Arin," he said, his voice grave, "we heard you've come back to stay in the manor. I must warn you, this place is not safe after dark." Arin raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The elder exchanged glances with the others before continuing. "The manor. It's cursed. Shadows move on their own, and strange noises echo through the halls. We've all heard them. Some say it's the spirits of the past, restless and angry." "Spirits?" Arin repeated, incredulous. "You can't be serious." One of the women in the group, an elderly lady with deep-set eyes, stepped forward. "It's not just talk, child. Many have tried to stay here, but none could last more than a few nights. They say the shadows come alive after sundown, whispering things that no living person should hear." Arin's skepticism hardened. "With all due respect, I don't believe in ghosts. My grandmother lived here her entire life without any problems." The elder shook his head. "She was one of the few who could. But since she passed, the shadows have grown stronger. We just want to make sure you're safe." "Thank you for your concern," Arin replied, her tone polite but firm. "But I'll be fine. I don't scare easily." The villagers exchanged uneasy looks but said no more. As they turned to leave, the elder gave her one last warning. "Don't stay here after dark, Miss Arin. The shadows are not what they seem." Arin watched them go, her mind swirling with thoughts. The villagers' fear was palpable, but she couldn't bring herself to believe in their stories. She had always been a rational person, grounded in logic and reason. Ghosts and curses were just tales told to scare children, nothing more. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manor, Arin closed the door and locked it behind her. The house creaked and groaned as the night settled in, but she shook off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. It was just an old house, after all, nothing more. Or so she told herself. The days passed slowly in the village, each one blurring into the next as Arin adjusted to life in the old manor. The initial unease she felt when she first arrived had started to dissipate, replaced by a sense of nostalgia for the time she had spent there as a child. She busied herself with cleaning the manor, clearing away the layers of dust that had settled over the years, and restoring the old furniture to its former glory. But as she settled in, the strange occurrences began. It started with small things, barely noticeable at first. Arin would leave a room, only to return and find objects slightly out of place. A chair that had been pushed in would now be pulled out. The curtains, which she distinctly remembered leaving open, would be drawn shut. She brushed it off as her own forgetfulness, the result of exhaustion from all the cleaning and organizing. However, as the days turned into weeks, the occurrences grew more unsettling. One evening, as she was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she heard a soft whisper echoing down the hallway. It was faint, almost like a distant breeze, but it carried a chilling tone that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She paused, knife in hand, and strained to listen, but the whispering had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Shaking her head, she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The house was old, after all, and old houses made noises, creaks, groans, even whispers, perhaps. But the rationalization didn't completely erase the feeling of unease that had begun to take root in her mind. The shadows, too, began to play tricks on her. At first, it was just a fleeting movement out of the corner of her eye, something she would catch sight of just as it disappeared. A dark blur darting across the wall, gone before she could fully register it. She dismissed these as tricks of the light, the result of living in a house where the sun struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of trees outside. But soon, the shadows became more persistent. They seemed to linger in the corners of rooms, just beyond the reach of the light. Arin would turn her head, certain she had seen something move, only to find nothing there. The shadows seemed to grow bolder at night, dancing along the walls as she walked through the darkened hallways, always just out of reach, always just out of sight. The whispers returned, too, more frequently now. They would start as she was drifting off to sleep, faint murmurs that she couldn't quite make out. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the old pipes groaning as the house settled. But there was a distinct cadence to the whispers, a rhythmic rise and fall that suggested speech, though the words were impossible to decipher. The nightmares began not long after. Every night, Arin would be visited by the same terrifying dream. She was standing in the grand hall of the manor, the room bathed in an eerie, pale light. In the center of the room stood a woman in black, her face obscured by a veil. The woman's shoulders shook as she wept silently, her cries echoing through the empty hall. Arin would try to approach her, to ask who she was and why she was crying, but her feet would feel like lead, refusing to move. As the dream progressed, the woman would slowly raise her head, the veil parting to reveal hollow, empty eyes. Her lips would move, forming Arin's name in a hoarse, broken whisper. Arin would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of her name still ringing in her ears. She tried to dismiss the dreams as nothing more than stress, the result of being alone in a big, empty house, surrounded by the memories of the past. But the more she tried to ignore them, the more vivid they became. The woman in black began to feel like a real presence, something more than just a figment of her imagination. One particularly stormy night, after another restless sleep plagued by the same nightmare, Arin awoke to the sound of something thudding softly from above. Startled, she sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing across the floor above her. Her heart raced as she realized the sound was coming from the attic. Grabbing a flashlight, Arin steeled herself and made her way up the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air grew colder with each step she took, and the shadows seemed to press in around her, whispering in their unintelligible language. She reached the attic door, her hand trembling as she turned the rusted knob. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, cavernous space beyond. Arin swept the beam of her flashlight across the room, revealing piles of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as she stepped inside. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Just the remnants of the past, left to decay in the attic's gloom. But as she moved deeper into the room, the flashlight beam caught something, an old, battered trunk pushed into the corner, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Curiosity getting the better of her, Arin knelt beside the trunk and carefully pried it open. Inside, she found a collection of old family heirlooms, photographs, trinkets, and at the very bottom, an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Arin recognized it immediately. It was her grandmother's journal. Her breath caught in her throat as she carefully opened the journal, the pages brittle beneath her fingers. She began to read, the words scrawled in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. The entries started off innocuously enough, everyday musings, notes about the weather, and snippets of village gossip. But as she read on, the tone of the entries began to change. Her grandmother wrote of strange occurrences in the manor, whispers in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and a sense of being watched. The entries grew more frantic as time went on, her grandmother's words hinting at something darker lurking within the walls of the house. And then, Arin found the entry that made her blood run cold. Her grandmother wrote of a family curse, a dark secret that had been passed down through generations. She spoke of the whispering shadows, malevolent spirits bound to the manor, born from an ancient wrong that had never been righted. The shadows, she wrote, were drawn to the blood of their descendants, seeking to claim them as their own. Arin's hand shook as she read the final entry, written just days before her grandmother's death. It spoke of a woman in black, a ghostly figure who wept for the sins of the past, her cries a harbinger of doom. Her grandmother had been certain that the curse would not die with her, that it would pass to Arin, the last of their line. The words seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around Arin like a cold, suffocating embrace. She could feel the shadows closing in around her, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The journal slipped from her hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. As she stood there, the realization of what she had uncovered slowly sank in. The strange occurrences, the whispers, the shadows, they weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real, and they were coming for her. The shadows had found their next victim. The days following the discovery of her grandmother's journal were a blur of fear and confusion for Arin. The oppressive atmosphere in the manor grew heavier with each passing hour, and the once sporadic occurrences of strange happenings now became a relentless assault on her senses. The shadows were everywhere, and the whispers had grown louder, more insistent, calling her name with an urgency that made her blood run cold. Arin knew she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She had to understand what was happening, why her family was cursed, and most importantly, how she could put an end to it. The journal had hinted at something terrible in her family's past, something that had bound the spirits to the manor and condemned her ancestors to a life of torment. Driven by desperation, Arin began to dig deeper into her family's history, scouring the village for any clues she could find. She visited the local library, an ancient building filled with dusty tomes and records dating back centuries. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a knowing expression, eyed her warily but offered no objections as Arin requested access to the oldest records. The village's history was filled with tales of tragedy and hardship, but as she sifted through the yellowed pages of old documents, one story stood out, a story that sent a chill through her heart. It was the story of her great-grandmother, a woman named Lila, who had lived in the manor many years ago. Lila had been a healer, known throughout the village for her knowledge of herbs and remedies. She had helped many villagers during times of illness and had been respected, even revered, for her skills. But as Arin read further, she discovered a darker side to the story. One winter, a terrible sickness had swept through the village, claiming the lives of many, including several children. Despite her best efforts, Lila had been unable to save them. Desperate for someone to blame, the grief-stricken villagers had turned on her, accusing her of witchcraft. They believed she had brought the sickness upon them, cursing their children out of spite or envy. The accusations had spread like wildfire, fueled by fear and superstition. In the dead of night, a mob of villagers had stormed the manor, dragging Lila from her bed. They took her to the grand hall, the very place where Arin now stood in her nightmares, and there, they had condemned her to death. Arin's breath caught in her throat as she read the next part of the story, her heart pounding in her chest. As the villagers prepared to carry out their sentence, Lila had cursed them with her dying breath. She swore that the shadows of the past would never rest, that they would haunt the village and its people for eternity. She vowed that her own bloodline would suffer as well, tormented by the spirits of those who had wronged her. The curse had been born in that moment, a dark and powerful force that had bound the spirits of the villagers to the manor, trapping them in the shadows where they would whisper and weep for their sins. And with each generation, the curse had grown stronger, claiming the lives of Arin's ancestors one by one. As Arin closed the book, her hands trembling, she realized the full extent of the horror she had uncovered. The shadows, the whispers, the woman in black, they were all manifestations of the curse, spirits bound to the manor by her great-grandmother's wrath. They were trapped in an endless cycle of torment, reliving the night of their deaths over and over again. But there was something more, something that made Arin's blood run cold. The curse had been passed down through the generations, and now it was her turn to face it. The shadows had been waiting for her, drawn to her blood, to the very essence of her being. The woman in black was Lila, her great-grandmother, and the tears she wept were for the lives she had taken, for the family she had condemned to a life of misery. Arin understood now why the manor had felt so suffocating, why the whispers had grown louder and the shadows more menacing. The curse was reaching its climax, and the spirits were demanding justice. They wanted her to right the wrongs of the past, to clear Lila's name, and to break the cycle of vengeance that had bound them all. But how could she do that? How could she break a curse that had persisted for decades, one that had claimed the lives of so many before her? Arin knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, guidance, something that could show her the way. She turned back to her grandmother's journal, flipping through the pages in search of answers. Near the end of the journal, she found a passage that stood out. Her grandmother had written about a ritual, one that could potentially break the curse. It was a dangerous and difficult process, one that required a pure heart and an unwavering resolve. The ritual involved confronting the spirits directly, facing them in the place where the curse had been born, the grand hall of the manor. Arin would have to summon the spirits, speak to them, and offer them something in exchange for their release. It was a daunting task, one that could very well cost her her life, but it was the only way to end the torment that had plagued her family for so long. With a heavy heart, Arin realized that she had no other choice. The shadows were closing in, and the whispers were growing more urgent. Time was running out. If she didn't act soon, the curse would consume her, just as it had consumed those who came before her. That night, as the storm raged outside and the shadows danced on the walls, Arin prepared herself for the ritual. She gathered the necessary items, candles, herbs, and a silver locket that had belonged to her great-grandmother, and made her way to the grand hall. The room was just as she had seen it in her nightmares, cold and foreboding, the air thick with the weight of the past. With trembling hands, Arin lit the candles and placed them in a circle on the floor. She stood in the center, clutching the locket to her chest, and began to recite the words from her grandmother's journal. The air around her grew colder, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, swirling around her like a dark, suffocating mist. As she spoke, the whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening roar. The shadows began to coalesce, forming into the shapes of the villagers, their faces twisted in agony and fear. And in the center of the room, the woman in black appeared, her form more solid than ever before. She looked at Arin with hollow, empty eyes, her tears flowing like rivers down her pale cheeks. Arin's voice trembled, but she continued the ritual, speaking directly to the spirits. She begged them for forgiveness, for understanding. She told them of the pain and suffering the curse had caused, of the lives it had ruined. She pleaded with them to let go of their anger, to find peace in the afterlife. The woman in black stepped forward, her hand outstretched as if to touch Arin's face. Her lips moved, forming words that Arin could barely hear over the roar of the storm outside. "Free us," the spirit whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "Free us from this torment." Arin knew what she had to do. She took the locket, the symbol of her family's legacy, and placed it on the floor at the center of the circle. She spoke the final words of the ritual, offering the locket as a token of her sincerity, a symbol of her willingness to break the cycle of vengeance and pain. For a moment, there was silence. The shadows froze, the whispers ceased, and the air grew still. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the shadows began to dissipate, dissolving into nothingness. The spirits of the villagers faded away, their forms losing shape as they were finally released from their eternal prison. The woman in black lingered for a moment longer, her gaze locked on Arin's, before she too began to fade. "Thank you," the spirit whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have set us free." And with that, she was gone. The grand hall was empty once more, the oppressive weight of the past lifted. Arin fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the realization of what she had done sank in. The curse was broken, the spirits were free, and her family was finally at peace. But as the storm outside began to subside, Arin knew that the cost of breaking the curse had been high. The manor, once a place of torment and suffering, was now just an empty shell, its secrets laid bare. The shadows had been banished, but the memories of what had happened here would remain with her forever. With the ritual complete and the spirits at rest, Arin stood and gathered her things. The manor was no longer her home, it was a relic of the past, a place where the echoes of history would forever linger. She would leave the village, leave the manor behind, and start a new life, free from the burden of her family's dark legacy. But as she walked through the now silent halls one last time, Arin couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows, though banished, would never truly leave her. They had been a part of her for so long, a part of her blood, her very being. And though she had freed the spirits of the past, she knew that the memory of the whispering shadows would haunt her forever. Arin's ordeal at the manor took a terrifying turn after uncovering the dark truth about her great-grandmother, Lila, and the curse that bound the restless spirits to the house. The once fleeting shadows had now become full-fledged apparitions, ghostly figures of the villagers who had condemned Lila. They stalked Arin relentlessly, their hollow eyes filled with anger and sorrow, their hands reaching out as if to drag her into their misery. The nights were the worst. As soon as darkness fell, the manor became a haunted battlefield. The spirits would emerge from the shadows, filling the rooms with their tormented cries. Arin could hear them wailing in the hallways, sobbing in the corners, and whispering curses in her ears. The apparitions grew more aggressive with each passing night, no longer content with merely haunting her, they wanted to break her. They would appear suddenly, without warning, their ghastly faces twisted in expressions of agony and rage. Sometimes they would stand silently at the foot of her bed, staring at her with empty eyes until she woke up screaming. Other times, they would surround her, their cold hands brushing against her skin, filling her with an unbearable chill that left her paralyzed with fear. Arin's sanity began to unravel. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every corner of the manor seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, every creak of the floorboards or flicker of the candlelight a reminder that she was never truly alone. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, and Arin found herself teetering on the edge of madness. In a desperate attempt to find solace, Arin turned once more to her grandmother's journal, searching for anything that could help her end the torment. She knew now that the curse was real, and that she had to break it before it consumed her entirely. The journal had already provided her with the truth about her family's dark history, but she needed something more, something that could save her from the wrath of the spirits. And then she found it, a ritual, buried within the pages of the journal, that her grandmother had written about in great detail. It was a ritual designed to confront the past, to face the spirits head-on and offer them a chance at peace. It was dangerous, but it was the only way to end the curse. The ritual involved summoning the spirit of her great-grandmother, Lila, the one who had cast the curse in the first place. Arin would have to confront her, to plead for forgiveness on behalf of the family, and to ask that the curse be lifted. But this was no simple task. The ritual required a strong will, a pure heart, and the courage to face the darkest parts of her family's history. Despite her fear, Arin knew she had to go through with it. The alternative was unthinkable, being consumed by the vengeful spirits and losing herself completely. The thought of becoming another lost soul in the manor, trapped forever in the shadows, filled her with dread. She had to try, no matter the cost. The ritual had to be performed at midnight, in the grand hall where Lila had been condemned all those years ago. Arin prepared herself, gathering the necessary items, a black candle, a mirror, a strand of her own hair, and a piece of her great-grandmother's locket. These objects were to be placed at the center of a chalk circle she would draw on the floor, surrounded by protective symbols. As the hour approached, Arin made her way to the grand hall, the very room where she had seen the ghost of Lila in her nightmares. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to watch her every move, as if anticipating what was to come. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the only way. With trembling hands, Arin drew the circle on the cold, stone floor, carefully inscribing the symbols her grandmother had described. She placed the candle at the center, lighting it with a match, and set the mirror before it. The flickering flame cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more foreboding. Arin took a deep breath and began to recite the incantation from the journal, her voice echoing in the empty hall. The words were in an ancient language she didn't fully understand, but she spoke them with conviction, her heart filled with the desperate hope that this would work. As she chanted, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. The candle's flame wavered, and the mirror reflected a darkness so deep it felt as though it could swallow her whole. But Arin didn't stop. She continued the ritual, even as the air became thick with an unnatural energy that made it difficult to breathe. Suddenly, the shadows began to move, swirling around the circle like a dark, oppressive fog. The apparitions of the villagers appeared, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence, their faces contorted with anguish. They surrounded Arin, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, the ghost of her great-grandmother, Lila. She was exactly as Arin had seen her in her nightmares, dressed in black, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held a burning intensity that made Arin's heart race with fear. Lila stepped into the circle, her presence causing the candle to flicker wildly. She stared at Arin with a mixture of anger and longing, as if she recognized her but couldn't decide whether to forgive her or condemn her. Arin felt a wave of emotion wash over her, fear, guilt, sadness, but she pushed it all aside. She had to stay focused. She had to complete the ritual. "Great-grandmother," Arin began, her voice trembling. "I know you have suffered. I know what was done to you was unjust, and I am sorry. I am so so sorry." Lila's ghost remained silent, her expression unreadable. "But the curse," Arin continued, "it has hurt so many people, our family, the villagers. It has caused so much pain. Please, I beg you, lift the curse. Let the spirits find peace. Let our family find peace." The air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. The shadows pulsed, and the ghostly figures of the villagers drew closer, their whispers rising to a crescendo. Arin felt as though the very walls of the manor were closing in on her, but she stood her ground, meeting Lila's gaze with determination. "Please," Arin whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Forgive us. Forgive me. Let this end." For a long moment, Lila's ghost simply stared at her, as if weighing her words. The tension in the air was unbearable, and Arin felt her heart pounding so hard it might burst from her chest. She didn't know if the ritual had worked, if she had said the right things, or if she was about to be consumed by the darkness that surrounded her. Then, slowly, Lila's expression softened. The anger in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep, overwhelming sadness. She reached out a hand, and for a moment, Arin thought she would touch her. But instead, Lila touched the locket on the floor, the last remnant of her life, her family, and the love she had once known. As Lila's fingers brushed the locket, the room was filled with a blinding light. The shadows recoiled, the apparitions of the villagers dissipated, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the manor for so long began to lift. The whispers ceased, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the manor was silent. The light enveloped Lila's ghost, and as it did, Arin saw a look of peace wash over her great-grandmother's face. The spirit's form began to fade, dissolving into the light, until all that was left was a faint shimmer in the air. "Thank you," Lila's voice echoed softly, a final whisper that resonated in Arin's heart. "You have set us free." And with that, Lila was gone. Arin stood alone in the grand hall, the silence almost deafening after the chaos of the ritual. The candle had burned out, and the mirror lay shattered on the floor, but the room was no longer filled with darkness. The oppressive presence had vanished, leaving only the faintest trace of lingering sorrow in the air. The curse was broken. The spirits were free. Arin sank to her knees, overcome with relief and exhaustion. The ordeal had taken everything out of her, but she had succeeded. She had done what her ancestors could not. She had confronted the past, faced the shadows, and brought peace to the restless spirits. As she sat in the quiet of the grand hall, Arin knew that she had finally ended the cycle of pain and vengeance that had plagued her family for generations. The manor, once a place of torment, was now a place of rest. The shadows were gone, and the house, though still old and filled with memories, felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its walls. But as Arin rose to her feet and prepared to leave the manor behind, she couldn't help but glance back one last time. The grand hall, the site of so much suffering, was now bathed in the soft light of the dawn. The curse had been broken, but the memory of what had happened here would remain with her forever. As Arin stood in the grand hall of the manor, the air was thick with the palpable tension of the ritual she had performed. The shadows, once tormenting and relentless, seemed to coalesce around her, forming the ghastly figures of the villagers who had condemned her great-grandmother. The room was cold, the darkness pressing in from all sides as if trying to smother any light or hope. In the center of the room, the flickering candlelight cast long, quivering shadows across the walls, highlighting the terror in Arin's eyes. The mirror she had placed for the ritual reflected not just the room but the distorted fears and guilt that had haunted her since her arrival. As she prepared to confront the vengeful spirit of her great-grandmother, the oppressive atmosphere grew almost unbearable. The apparition of Lila, Arin's great-grandmother, materialized before her. She was as Arin had seen her before, dressed in black, her face pale and streaked with tears. The sorrow and anger that had marred her features now seemed even more intense, her presence a mix of ethereal beauty and palpable rage. Arin's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the spirit, her fear and desperation pushing her forward. The shadows around her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her rapid heartbeat, the whispers of the spirits growing louder, more frantic. "Great-grandmother," Arin began, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know you have been wronged. I know what happened to you was a terrible injustice. I am so sorry for what was done to you, for the pain and suffering you endured." Lila's ghost looked at her, her eyes filled with a complex blend of anger, sadness, and a glimmer of something that resembled hope. The spirits of the villagers gathered around, their faces twisted in various expressions of anguish and resentment, their forms flickering like shadows in the dim light. "I offer my life," Arin continued, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I will give my life if it means bringing peace to you and to the others who have suffered because of the curse. Please, let this end. Let the shadows be free." The grand hall seemed to grow colder still, and the shadows seemed to press in closer, as if the manor itself were listening to her plea. Lila's ghost remained silent, her gaze piercing and unwavering. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, the weight of Arin's words hanging heavy in the air. In the midst of this agonizing silence, a faint glow began to emanate from Lila's ghost. Her form shimmered with a soft, otherworldly light, and for a brief moment, the anguished faces of the villagers seemed to soften. The shadows on the walls flickered and shifted, as if in response to the change in Lila's demeanor. Then, with a voice that seemed to echo from both the depths of sorrow and the heights of revelation, Lila spoke. "I was innocent," she said, her voice carrying a profound sadness. "I never intended to harm anyone. I only sought justice for the wrongs done to me and my family." The villagers' fear and hatred twisted the truth, and their anger bound my spirit to this place. Arin's tears fell freely now, her face wet with the relief and sorrow of understanding. "I know," she whispered. "I understand now. And I am sorry for the suffering that has continued because of the curse." Lila's ghost reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the edge of the mirror. The soft glow surrounding her grew brighter, enveloping the room in a warm, comforting light. The shadows that had clung to the walls and floor began to waver, their dark forms losing shape and substance. "You have shown great courage and compassion," Lila continued, her voice growing softer. "In seeking the truth and offering yourself for the sake of peace, you have redeemed not only yourself but also the souls trapped here." The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the oppressive darkness began to lift. The apparitions of the villagers started to fade, their forms dissolving into the light as their anger and sorrow were finally acknowledged and soothed. The shadows that had once been so menacing now dissipated, their malignant presence vanishing with each passing moment. As the last of the spirits faded away, the grand hall was left in a state of serene quiet. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a gentle warmth. The candle's light flickered one final time before extinguishing, its purpose fulfilled. Arin stood alone in the now empty room, her heart heavy with the weight of what had happened but also lightened by the release of the curse. The manor, once a place of torment and darkness, felt peaceful and calm. The echoes of the past had been laid to rest, and the house, though still old and filled with history, was now free from the shadows that had haunted it for so long. With the dawn beginning to break outside, casting a soft glow through the dusty windows, Arin knew it was time to leave. She had come to the manor as a seeker of truth and had left with the weight of her family's dark past lifted from her shoulders. The curse had been broken, and the spirits had been freed, but the memories and lessons of her journey would stay with her forever. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave the village, Arin couldn't shake the feeling of the shadows lingering in the mist. They were no longer malevolent forces but rather a reminder of the depths of human suffering and the cost of uncovering old secrets. They served as a warning to those who might seek out the past, a reminder that some stories are best left untold. Arin took one last look at the manor, its once ominous presence now a silent sentinel to a chapter of history that had finally come to an end. With a final, resolute glance, she turned and walked away, leaving the village and the manor behind. The whispers of the shadows remained in the mist, a haunting reminder of the legacy she had confronted and the peace she had won.